In Canberra today, I'm talking to Keith Lewin, who's Professor of Education and International Development at the University of Sussex. He's also Director of the research consortium CREATE, which developed the Zones of Exclusion model, and he's also one of the ERF's education specialists. Keith, we're going to be talking about secondary education today. Did you always have an interest in it?
Yes, I think I always had an interest, but particularly it developed when I was doing my master's degree in science policy. I was thinking about why some countries get rich and others stay poor. So secondary schooling is really this very important period in people's lives between the ages of 12 and 20, where in some sense they really do acquire their adult identities and their adult capabilities. It's where you acquire abstract thinking skill, the ability to solve problems in a rational way.
Why do you think then secondary education was more or less left out of the Education for All goals and the MDGs, if it was left out?
Well, I think the key is in your last inflection. It wasn't left out. This is only said by people who weren't actually at Jomtien or Dakar. If you look at the Dakar goals, you'll see that Goal 3, Goal 5 and Goal 6 are all directly relevant to secondary schooling.
Did some of the countries make that explicit, the need to ensure that secondary education had a key part in their plans and their investments?
Yes, I think the majority of countries, middle-income countries, never had a priority for primary schooling, largely perhaps because they thought they'd achieved it, which wasn't entirely true in terms of learning outcomes, but was true in terms of participation. But also because they took a much more balanced view for a development strategy. What we must remember is that educational development and educational aid is not about a small subsector. It's about a balanced approach to the development of a society as a whole. It is about the distribution of knowledge and skill in the population and its utilisation.
So what do you think the status of secondary education is now across the developing world?
I think secondary education over the next decade in many low and middle income countries will provide the key policy agenda and the key challenge for national governments to develop strategies that, as they say, work.
Do you think secondary education is going to be a key part of post-2015 goals? And if so, are there particular challenges ahead?
I think it already is. It's already in the report of the high-level panel as a commitment that lower secondary schooling should be universalised.
Cost is obviously going to be a big part of expanding senior secondary education in many countries. Are there other particular challenges and issues that countries will face and their partners will face?
There are many challenges, but since you start with cost, let's make it clear from the outset. Any country that spends 5% of GDP on its education system should be able to universalise access at least up to the age of 16. If it doesn't do so, then it's not allocating its resources in a very efficient way. Of course, all rich countries succeed in doing this, and there's no real reason why poorer countries shouldn't do the same.
So that could be a good rule of thumb to think about. 5% of GDP on education should cover primary and secondary.
And about 2%, 1.5 to 2% should be sufficient to universalise access to a secondary school system. There's another very simple rule. If you're spending more than about twice as much per secondary school child, then you won't universalise access within a sustainable budget.
Looking to the future, and staff of DFAT who may be thinking about programmes which will include secondary education or focus on secondary education, what guidance would you give to them in terms of thinking where they should put their investment and what aspects of secondary education would be important?
I think there are at least 3 priorities which create the challenge of the next decade. The first is about curriculum and pedagogy. In some sense, it's easy to imagine that the equation at primary school level is simple. Of course it isn't, but it is a set of curriculum priorities that must be about basic learning skills, about reading and writing, about numeracy, and about the beginning of abstract thinking skills. Secondary school level, there is much less consensus about what secondary schools are for. There are other challenges which must concern those involved in an aid relationship. They are partly about the flow of students through education systems. Who goes to secondary school, how they get there, and what kind of secondary school they go to are fundamental questions of flow, efficiency and effectiveness. That if you don't ensure that everybody has a fair chance of participating, you will be ineffective and inefficient.
In relation to cost, we hear increasingly about privatisation as a possible source of expanding access. What do you think of that?
There's no evidence that I know of that privatisation ever expanded access, except in the well-known sense that if a proportion of the population pay twice, if they go to private schools where they pay fees, in addition to paying their share of general taxation, then of course in principle they release some places which can be used for children from poorer households.
So it's an alternative source of education for some sections of the population, but better than that? More than that?
The jury is out. The jury really is out. If you seek what some people would call a private school effect, that is the idea that private schools actually do something different to public schools, the evidence from PISA across 72 countries is very clear. There is no private school effect.
It's interesting that you talked first about curriculum and pedagogy and then about access. But access clearly is important in terms of fairness and integrity of the system. Would it be true to say that there was a focus on primary education enrolments, therefore access, under the MDG goals, which we're trying to avoid in the future, looking at secondary or looking at a complete school education? So getting it right this time, whereas we might have had a wrong emphasis last time.
I think there very much are things that bilateral and multilateral agencies can learn from the experience of education for all as it was rolled out. One of the things that can be learned is to always remember you may think of yourself as an educational aid person, but you should think of yourself as a development person. Development is about economic growth. It's not only about rights. And the economic growth story on secondary schooling, I think, is quite straightforward. If you have ambitions to move above an economy which simply is generating revenue from primary commodities without processing them, adding value to them, then maybe you can do this with a workforce that has little more than primary schooling.
So thinking further ahead, say to 2030, what's your vision for education?
That's a very wide and large question. And I think you have to come back to the idea that it's a vision. There are visions, but there's not one. They will be very differentiated. Education systems have to become more diverse in their capability to accept a wide range of different learning outcomes. And the older the child, the more likely that is. Of course, in the majority of countries, if not all, education at higher levels will be internationalized. Internationalized in the sense of more and more people and more young people having access to the internet, to all the sources of information and self-instruction, and massive online courses that are becoming available at costs that many people in many parts of the world can afford.
So secondary education is very much at the centre of a number of areas which lead to and contribute to economic growth.
I think so, and it does of course sit between primary schooling and tertiary education. But the fact of the matter of course is that you cannot expand your tertiary education without having an adequate supply, not only of people who completed secondary schooling, but people who learned a lot while they were there.
We started with you saying that you'd got interested in secondary when you were looking at science policy. Is science still an abiding interest? Would you like to see that taking a large proportion of secondary curriculum time?
Yeah, I would, because one of my first identities was as a physicist. And this is a window on the world, which is a particular way of thinking. Of course, it doesn't capture everything that should be valued. But it is one of the reasons which have transformed societies from what they were to what they are. It is the defense against superstition. It is the defense against demagoguery in some sense. And it's certainly the means through which the physical environment can be transformed, hopefully for the good and of course sometimes for the worse. That's where the politics comes in.
Keith, thank you very much for talking to us about secondary education today.
Thank you. My pleasure.